Ex Nihilo. Talking to
Dear John Aziz, we're looking forward to today's conversation because a view like yours is rarely heard about the October 7th Gaza conflict, which often produces these extremely one sided and often belligerent opinions. Your voice, as a British born Palestinian musician, is what makes your writing about the Middle East conflict so germanely powerful. But before we get into that, tell us about your life stories. What brought your family to England, and what attracted you to music, digital recording, and the intellectual discourse on the Middle East? And how did your parents?
My life story condensed. So I was born in the
Yeah,
UK.
yeah.
My mother is a British woman, and my father was a Palestinian. He came to the West as a result of wanting to seek educational opportunities. He was a physicist by training.
Oh,
So he yeah, that was the thing he was interested in. So my parents met. I was born in the UK. My life story has been I always loved music. I always loved reading. I always loved history. I could see that there was kind of a shadow over my family and over the situation in Palestine that my family was living with. I thought there's a shadow over it. The situation it's never been good, and there's an impact that has upon anyone who's born underneath that and grows up with it. And the impact of that is I think there's a level of traumatization with growing up living under military occupation continuously. Of course, I think that's partly one of the reasons why my father left. He wanted to live in a free
free
country.
life.
Yeah,
sure.
because living in a war zone, living in the conflict, it grates you down. It grates you down. It bears on
Yeah.
your consciousness. So I could see there was a shadow there, and I wanted to understand the factors that were preventing peace and that were preventing a normal life and a coexistent life for the people there. Because of course, if you study the history, you realize that there's a long history of Jewish
Sure.
life in
Sure.
that region. There's a long history of Muslims. There's a long history of Christians. All those groups of people have some
Yeah.
level of roots and ancestry there. And what I've always found hard to process, hard to conceptualize was why couldn't we all get along? And I grew up with my life, and originally I studied English literature at university.
Then
Um,
data science. But
well, I went back to university because I studied English for a year. I
uh,
then went off and started doing music because the
interesting.
thing I was interested in the most was music.
Okay.
And then I had a period where I was doing a lot of music, and I was in bands and so forth. And there was other things like working as a music teacher, working as producing other artists. But eventually I did end up studying data science and going in a completely different direction because I saw on the other end of the spectrum that the future is so it's so tightly wound up with artificial intelligence and robotization. We're going towards the singularity. It's a singularity, an accelerating system of technology where the technology is itself producing more technology. and and I,
Yeah. But little question in between. So, did the family regularly make returns, like vacation or whatever, to Palestine? So there was like an ongoing, like familial bond.
so it was always difficult. I've entered Palestine, I believe, 4 times.
Oh, okay.
So there was a long trip when I was about 5 or 6. There was another trip when I was about 11. There was another trip when I was about 18 or so, and another one after that. and so I haven't visited that many times. One of the reasons why it's so hard to visit is because of because of the conflict. People who live a normal life in the West, they don't want to go to a place where you have to go through a military checkpoint, multiple military checkpoints actually, in order to access the village and visit your family. I don't, I like to see my family, and I love seeing Palestine, and I love the lifestyle, and I love the people, and I love just the the experience of being there, and I love being Palestinian. But it's hard to visit Palestine when you're there's an ongoing military conflict, a military occupation. So that is it's difficult.
What differences do you see when comparing your lifestyle with your relatives living in Palestine today? And how have these differences influenced the way you think?
So actually, my history is in the countryside in Palestine. Really, my family history is in the countryside. Well, for example, both my grandparents are illiterate.
Oh, yeah. Which is really a sign, yeah.
Yeah. So my father was kind of
The first person.
he was the first person in his family to get a university degree, first person in his family to get a master's degree and to get a PhD. So it's and multiple others have gone on since he did that to do that. So the opportunities that existed for Palestinians, there probably weren't that many, like in terms, especially for rural Palestinians where peasant farmers before the modernity. So my father was sort of benefiting from modernity, but he was the first in his family to go after these opportunities. And in terms of the differences between my life and the life of the people in Palestine, well, there is a level of convergence because we're all connected via the internet, right? So my life is quite different to my relatives because obviously I'm part of the Anglosphere. Obviously, my educational background is going to be quite different going through the British education system, but at the same time, I do feel like we're all on a pathway of convergence in terms of the way the modern world is working. It's driving us together with social media, it's driving us together with computing and AI, and that's the reality we're all going to be dealing with going forward. So, and funnily enough, it's not exactly accurate to say that the problems in Palestine, if we're going to get into talking about some of them. If you look at the protesters, for example, in London, they're chanting the same mantras and the same slogans oftentimes as some of the groups in Palestine, and the ideologies and the conflict of ideologies, the clash of ideologies, is something that is coming to the West, and maybe
the West, yeah.
Maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when I was a young child, that wasn't so true. Maybe there was a bit more separation, a bit more divorce. But the reality is we live in the modern world. We live in a world of social media. We live in a world of airliners. We live in a world of international shipping. And that means that the culture in one part of the world is going to affect the culture in another part of the world. I think the US and the UK, they've imported a lot of people from
Germany
the Middle East and Germany too, right? So when you import people, you import their culture.
Sure.
Yeah. And you import their ideologies. And that goes both ways. If someone from Manchester goes and lives in Palestine, then the culture of Manchester will
not that
the culture of Manchester will come to Palestine. But that's a reality. I think everyone around the world is kind of having to process.
Sure,
this interconnectivity.
The computer is a universal machine, so we know.
Yeah, but tell us, John, we're somewhat elderly gentlemen, and we've noticed some strange things in how the Palestinians have turned their great tragedy, that of the Nakba, into kind of a lifeblood and even a veritable cult of refugees that's been passed down for generations. When you compare it to post-war Germany, where more than 15 million Germans were forced to leave their homes in East Prussia, Pomerania, and Bohemia, the differences are stark because there the awareness of being refugees who lost their homeland died out within 2 generations. And none of them would ever think of demanding the return of Polish or Czech territory. Nevertheless, this is what's happening in Gaza. How do you explain this difference?
It's quite hard to explain as a difference because there's just two entirely different cultural narratives, and one side is going with one cultural narrative and another side is going with a completely different one. But you can see that there are two completely different narratives. And I think Europe historically has had a huge problem with being a center of violence and war and destruction. The two great world wars were centered in Europe. And I think after World War II, there was much more of an acceptance at both a political level and probably at a personal level, the man on the street, the man in the pub, that we were going to move on from that. And we were going to, take the necessary steps towards reconciliation and coexistence. And I think, we can criticize the European Union and we can criticize the European projects. We can criticize the policies of various European countries. But there has been a level of success in Europe in achieving a kind of coexistence. Maybe on some levels it's uneasy, but a French person can actually go to Germany. If a French person wants a right of return to Germany, they can actually have that, right? they can return if that's where their ancestors were from, to Germany. What exists right now between Israel and Palestine is not that level of commitment to any sort of reconciliation and mutualism. Certainly in the 1990s, maybe there was a little bit more of that. Maybe that's what was underpinning the Oslo Accords. And I think there was a level of that on both sides. If you look at the opinion polling of the time, there certainly were people on both sides who were saying, yes, we want to live together, we want to have a normal life, we want to have reconciliation. But the trouble is that right now, and certainly if you're talking about the narratives of a group like Hamas or a group like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they're motivated by a sort of this grand utopian religious vision of conquest, and the concept of a right to return it's kind of just a way of getting your foot in the door, right? The ultimate goal is, yes, the refugees go back, and then there's a majority of Muslims, maybe one generation down the line, or maybe even immediately, and then they vote for Hamas rule, and then there's an Islamic it's added to the Islamic Caliphate, right? Because they conceptually, these groups believe that Israel is what they would call Dar al-Islam, the land of Islam, the house of Islam. And this land now, because it was once colonized by Muslims and turned into a Muslim land, is eternally Muslim land. So, that's really the issue that we're talking about here. I think the rights of refugees ultimately are that you need to have somewhere safe to live. You need to be able to go back to a normal life. You need to be able to get on with your life. You need to have access to education, access to infrastructure, access to, investment and capital, and all the sorts of things that give people a normal life. That's what I want for Palestinians. I want Palestinians to have a country, to have peace, and to have a normal life. And that's what I'm focused on. But a group like, Hamas, their ideology is just completely radically different to mine. And they're viewing things not in the kind of pragmatic liberal terms that I'm viewing them in. They're viewing them in terms of really grand kind of apocalyptic utopian narratives of conquest and religious warfare, ultimately, right?
How did you personally experience October the 7th? What went through your mind when the images from Israel appeared on the news, especially when you saw how the Hamas terrorists targeted Nova Festival attendees, who were all peace-loving young people who could just as easily have been attending one of your concerts?
Unfortunately, I think the Hamas narrative is the opposite to that, right? The Hamas narrative is that all Israelis are soldiers. So you say, and I do think of it this way. The Nova Festival attendees are just peace-loving Israelis who want to have, they just want to go and dance. They just want to have a normal evening of entertainment. The trouble is that Hamas's perspective is just radically, radically different to that. And their view is that all Israelis ultimately are soldiers. And all Israelis are legitimate targets, and that's that's what they believe. So my perspective on October the 7th was, I had been doing, for the kind of 3 years before that, I'd kind of been working quietly, almost as a hobby, on trying to meet Israelis, trying to talk to Israelis, trying to understand their side of the argument, trying to understand their perspective, and trying to understand what we need to do to achieve peace. Because as I mentioned, there's this kind of this shadow over my life, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the shadow over my life and over my family's lives. and they have to go through checkpoints to do anything. They have to get a permit from the Israeli government if they want to go to Jerusalem. I really wanted to fix this problem. I wanted to be part of the solution. I wanted to be a small part of the solution.
Sure.
And I'd been trying to trying to understand the problem and trying to advocate for solutions and what I believe is reconciliation, coexistence. And so for me it was just this incredibly sad, horrific event, because I knew that this was going to knock peace 5, 10, 20, 25, 50 years down the line. It was going to make everything much harder. It was going to create so much more collective trauma for both Israelis and Palestinians that we were going to have to resolve, and there was already enough collective trauma. I think that's one of the biggest things that's perpetuating the conflict is the traumatization of people on both sides. People are hurt, people are traumatized, and there's a lack of trust because of that, right? Israelis feel like if a Palestinian says, I want peace, actually, we're about to stab them in the back. They might let us into their country, and then we stab them in the back. And unfortunately, that's happened, right? That's happened with, stabbings and shootings and car attacks and so forth, because that not everyone's truthful. A lot of people believe that this is a civilizational conflict, and ultimately the solution is on the battlefield. So that's the difficulty here. So for me, October the 7th was quite emotional, because I felt like I felt like there was a really good opportunity back in 2021, 2022 to try and put this collective trauma behind us and to try and work towards reconciliation. That's what I wanted. And it felt like Hamas had thrown all of that under the bus. I was incredibly disappointed, and I still am. But I think in the end, the solution is the same. The solution is the same. We have to commit collectively to say that this conflict isn't working, right? It's miserable for Palestinians. Israelis have it a little bit better because they tend to win the actual battles. They tend to win the conflict, but there's still problems for them. They don't want their leaders being accused of war crimes in the ICC. They don't want to be accused as a nation of genocide in the ICJ. So there's the nature of the conflict means that there's downsides to it for both people. So we need to sit down as adults respectfully and talk about reconciliation. We need to talk about reconciliation. We need to talk about peace. That's ultimately going to be the solution.
So, John, I mean, yes, I think we both agree you have to give peace a chance. So tell us what you see the living conditions of your Palestinian relatives now. And when you talk with them, what are they thinking? Do they tell you about their anger and frustrations? How do they react to being held hostage by Hamas? Or more precisely, by people like Yahya Sinwar, who grew rich off of his subjects' misery while living comfortably in Qatar?
I'll be honest with you. In terms of talking to my family, my Arab Middle Eastern family about politics, I would do it with my dad, who unfortunately has passed away, and I would do it with close family members. I certainly try to avoid doing it with cousins. So to be quite honest, to be quite honest, my conversations with my cousins very often are basically on the level of, how are you doing? How's your wife? Has anything happened? And my family is concentrated in the West Bank. We don't live in Gaza. We're not from Gaza.
Okay.
So we're not suffering directly from the war. I don't have any relatives in Gaza, but they do live under the occupation in the West Bank. So obviously life for them is bad, right? Life for them is bad, but it's not as bad as if you're living in Gaza. You're not. They're not in a tent. They're just living in their homes in the West Bank. And when we have discussed things, my family are predominantly quite educated people, and yes, they want a normal life. Of course they do. They want, but I think a lot of the time they would conceptualize it as they want to end the occupation. The way I would go forward with that is with a two-state solution. I certainly don't see any chance for enacting Hamas's vision of overthrowing Israel completely. I think a two-state solution is much more plausible, much more achievable, and it's going to give Palestinians a normal life. I think that the reality for the people who have lived alongside Yahya Sinwar in Gaza is hell.
Yeah.
That's hell. What's happened to Gaza is the implementation of Hamas's ideology has led them to the gates of hell, to total destruction. If you start, Hamas's belief is that we are gonna go. I think there's a direct quote from Yahya Sinwar: "We're gonna tear down the border and we're gonna rip out their hearts."
Yeah.
And that's what Hamas roughly did on October the 7th.
Yeah.
And the impact of that has been nightmarish for Palestinians in Gaza. That's the truth of it. I mean, we can talk about why didn't Egypt allow Palestinians, and we can also throw Israel into the mix to criticize Israel. Why didn't Israel and Egypt allow Palestinian refugees from Gaza to leave Gaza, to either go into the West Bank or to go into Israel 1948 or to go into Egypt, right? Some of my critics will throw it back to me. Oh, you just want the Palestinians to be ethnically cleansed. No, I don't want Ukrainians to be ethnically cleansed because they want to evacuate from Vladimir Putin attacking them. There's a horrible war going on in Gaza right now, and the civilians of Gaza should be allowed to evacuate, whether that's to the West Bank, or whether that's to Egypt, or whether that's into Israel. Or it's really been a disaster, and we can throw lots and lots of blame around. What's better than throwing blame around is probably saying how do we solve the problem, which is why I try to stay fairly solutions oriented, and I try to stay fairly focused on how do we understand each other better, how do we reach reconciliation.
In your keynote video, you pointed out that the Jewish-Palestinian conflict goes much further in history. And it's not enough to just attribute it to Hamas and its charter, which on the one hand longs for an apocalypse, while on the other seeks something like the annihilation of Jews. It's also insufficient just considering this in the historic context of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and his adoption of Nazi propaganda, or the Sayyid Qutb and the pogroms of the 1920s and 30s. Nor can we trace its origin back to Theodor Herzl's Jewish state and the Jewish return to Palestine. There's this battle cry chanted at many of today's demonstrations, Kaiba, Kaiba, Ya Yahud, a battle cry harking back to Muhammad's 628 conquest of Kaiba's Jewish community, which gave Islamic law its precedent for determining the status of dhimmis, the non-believers, or the other people of the books which are just tolerate. As you rightly point out, it seems that we're dealing with a medieval form of Islamic imperialism, a claim to world domination standing in an almost grotesque contradiction to the political real weakness of these countries, the backwardness.
That is the reality of what Hamas believes, right? Hamas is ultimately an Islamist organization seeking Islamic rule over the entirety of the land, and ultimately probably some sort of caliphate, spanning the entirety of the Middle East and maybe other parts of the world, right? There is a precedent of Islamic imperialism. Of course, my critics will throw it back. Well, what about the right-wing Israelis who want to rule from between the Nile and the Euphrates? And yeah, I think that's crazy too, right? I think I'm not in favor of any sort of imperialism or ethno-nationalism or religious theocracy. I think all of that needs to be left in the past where it belongs. We need to be adults and we need to be modern, and we need to think about really think about, is this going to create a good life for our children? And Hamas's ideology hasn't done that. And that's a miserable situation for Palestinians. And I feel awfully for my people and for Palestinian people, but I don't think that we're going to solve this problem with the same level of consciousness that created it.
Yeah, and we recently had this conversation with a young Israeli who, after growing up in Long Island, New York, he moves to Jerusalem, where he wants to learn Arabic. Because it was during the Ninth Intifada, he poses as an American student exchanging English lessons on an internet app. And he develops a sense of friendship. But whenever he reveals his Israeli identity, his interlocutor's reaction was, even if they were well educated, was always the same. Israel doesn't exist. And if the conversation didn't stop there, they would go on to tell him that Abraham, David, and King Solomon were all Muslim, and that today's Jews are kind of a depleted, perverted group. What strikes the Western ear is astonishingly distorted, is this complete absence of historical awareness. How is it in this Manichaean kind of Islamic historical worldview that there's only one side, being the other, being that of the infidels, of which the Jews are the worst? How can you reach a mutual understanding if this is what you have?
I think you have to be pragmatic, and I think you have to listen to the other people's side. And I think that's what I've done. And I think that's probably why I've had some success communicating with Jews and with Zionists, that maybe other people on the Palestinian side haven't had that success, because I've really tried to understand both their perspective and their history. The reality is, if you look at the genetic studies, genetically speaking, they are our cousins, right? We're an interwoven, interlocking people. The truth is, the Roman Empire, right, colonized Judea.
Sure.
The Roman Empire colonized Judea, and it enslaved and expelled Jewish people. And this is how you ended up getting Ashkenazi Jews and also other kinds of Jews being scattered around places like Europe, Eastern Europe, Germany, and also North Africa, where the Roman Empire was, right? A lot of Jewish people were scattered and displaced by the Roman Empire. This is the reality. These were people of the land, just like Palestinians, right? Descended from the same people, and they were scattered around Europe. And they were saying next year in Jerusalem for 1,500 years after they were scattered. They were victims of horrific violence, pogroms, ultimately the Nazi Holocaust. It doesn't surprise me at all to see them wanting to come back to the place where the Roman Empire displaced them from. There are falsehoods that can be perpetuated, right? And it's very dangerous when we perpetuate falsehoods, such as claiming, these Jews, they're not real Jews, they converted somewhere else, they're Khazarians or some completely debunked rubbish. Even the idea these are just random white Germans and Poles who just decided to pretend to be Jewish. They got to Europe because they were scattered there by the Roman Empire and by other various invasions and imperial. There was the Byzantine occupation of the Holy Land as well. So the Holy Land is the most settled and resettled parts in the entire world, because it's the land bridge between Europe and Africa and the Middle East. And of course, that has led to a lot of the Crusades and the fact that probably three of the largest religions, certainly the largest two. I know Judaism isn't particularly large by number, but it's large in impact, because three of the largest in impact religions have emerged from there. Yes, of course, you had Christian crusaders coming from Europe wanting to capture the Holy Land for, all these Christ is King, Deus Vult type people. Of course, the Jews who had been scattered to Europe also wanted to live there. And yes, obviously Muhammad, his armies ultimately conquered the Holy Land too. So you have these claims and you have these counterclaims. I think it's really important to listen and to respect other people, and that's really what I've tried to do, because I don't really believe in supersessionism. I don't. I suppose it's because I'm an atheist and not really a Muslim.
Interesting.
I kind of regard Islam and Judaism as both interesting and historically important, but ultimately false religions, right? I don't agree with their supernatural claims. I think they're I respect Muslims, I respect Jews, but I don't agree with the supernatural claims. And I certainly don't believe that Islam superseded Judaism as the true religion, because I don't believe in a true religion. I believe in the natural world, and Charles Darwin. So yeah.
As someone who's been deeply involved in the cultural history and philosophy of the machine, writing books about that, I've perceived the Muslim world as a region refusing to modernize itself since the Middle Ages. In Western Europe, alongside the cathedrals, universities were permanently established, and with the WeWork automaton's programmable time, that the machine, interest was also tamed, leading in short to proto-capitalism. The high point of this development is the printing press, which democratized knowledge and marked the Enlightenment's beginning. Despite its great heritage, none of this took hold in the Muslim world. As an exemplar, the Ottoman ruler Bayezid II responded to the publication of books by banning them on pain of death. Not only weren't books allowed to be printed, but it was also forbidden even to pick one up. For this reason, I've always seen political Islam, which asserted itself with Khomeini in 1979, as a modernization problem, even as a tragic event. Its failure to adopt capitalism and the Enlightenment has left it stuck in tribal thinking. For this reason alone, the apostate is still a problem for the Ummah today. Indeed, it's life-threatening to renounce Islam. What is your opinion on this?
I mean, what you say is historically true, but there is another side to it, which is that there was an Arab attempt at a kind of
In the
enlightenment.
10th century, there was a golden age in the 10th century, but it's
Well,
all
no,
short-lived.
I'm talking about in the 19th and the 20th century. There was an attempt that was called Nahda. It was an attempt at an Arab enlightenment, and I would probably consider myself to be a continuation of that. Right? What I'm advocating is a modernity and an enlightenment and
In the Arab world.
secularism and I suppose technologization and ultimately robotization and the singularity. By the way, it's all the same process.
That was the process when I talked about the machine, not about cultural differences. It was the machine taming somehow the European. The Europeans had enormous problems, accepting the interest, for example, in the 12th century. It was extremely complicated, etc. So I see that like an Arabic culture undergoing these same processes must face enormous challenges. So I do understand.
It absolutely is facing these challenges, and I salute all of the brave souls from around the Islamic world who are pushing towards a Middle Eastern enlightenment. And part of that does include recognition and reconciliation and coexistence, not only with Israel, but with Jewish people. I believe that ultimately we need to have the EU model in the Middle East. Oh, and that would include some sort of right of return, but it would include a right of return for the Jewish people who were displaced from across the Middle East, right? As I say, the French and the Germans, they have a right of return today because they have peace. Peace ultimately is a right of return. And I think if Jewish Yemenis want to go and live in Yemen, they should have that right. It shouldn't cost them their Israeli citizenship. They should be allowed to be Israeli, right? Just as living in Haifa shouldn't prevent someone from being a Palestinian citizen. The same principle as someone living in Berlin, that doesn't prevent them from being a French citizen, right? I think that's what we need to aim towards, but we need to do it in a kind of multilateral way involving all of the people of the Middle East, including the Jews, and including other minorities, including the Kurds, including the Yazidi, including all of the, repressed groups who have suffered under the tyrannical foot of various, horrific, theocratic, misogynistic, violent terror cults that have unfortunately dominated and smashed their way across the region again and again and again. The history of the region and the history of the Islamic colonization of the region is by the sword, including conversion by the sword, which is something that happened to... why are Palestinians and not Jews? Well, we are Israelites, right? As a Palestinian, I am an Israelite, but my ancestors were converted by the sword, and or at very least by conquest, if not on pain of death, although we know that Caliph al-Hakim in the 11th century did forcibly convert all of the Jews, or eventually they were allowed to convert back. I think it was a few years later. But there was forced conversion in the Levant under Caliph al-Hakim. Why is my family Muslim? It's forced conversion. It's conquering. Sure. That's the reality of the Middle East. And we need to go in a different direction. It's not to say that people who have devout belief in Islam shouldn't be allowed to practice their religion peacefully. Of course they should be, just like any religion, right? I believe in the equality of Islam and Judaism and the equality of Islam and Christianity. But conquering, no. Terrorism, no. Sex slaves, no. I think it's important to emphasize that for the majority of Muslims, their life is fairly normal. They're not involved in chanting Khayba Khayba Ya Yahud, right? But for the politics of the militant Islamists, the people who believe in conquering, I think that the West and probably ultimately the left on the West in particular, although it's across the spectrum, I think there is a tendency to frame the issue in terms of who has the most power. There was a debate between I think Chomsky and Michel Foucault. I saw made reference to, and Chomsky was just shocked at the fact that Foucault's belief basically was not, in disputes. It's not about who has the correct position morally, or who started it, or any of those alternatives. What Foucault cared about predominantly was who has the most power. And this ultimately is kind of a Marxist debate, and it's a Marxist narrative. The big problem with Karl Marx is that he didn't understand what value was. And we're getting into completely different, I'm slightly going off on a tangent here, but Karl Marx believed that value was an objective thing, and it was dictated by the amount of socially necessary labor to create a commodity. Whereas in the real world, what value actually is value is kind of a human notion of the inherent worth of something. So the entire kind of canon of Marxist thought is tinged. It's kind of tainted by this problem that Marx had, that he didn't really understand value. Marx wanted to interpret the capitalist system and the economic structure as one where capitalists were fundamentally ripping off their workers by stealing their surplus value, because he believed that the difference between what the worker is paid and the profit is that's something that the capitalist is, the profit is something that the capitalist is stealing. That's that the profit is the difference between what the laborer is paid and the price sold. And Marx believed that that was something that that capitalists were stealing. What Marx was kind of doing there, and why I went off on this tangent, is Marx wanted to create this dynamic between the oppressor and the oppressed. He believed the working classes were being oppressed through the theft of surplus value by the oppressor class. And this manner of thinking has seeped into so many different domains, right? It's become so normalized in our civilization, in Western civilization, to frame issues in terms of who has the most power. Because, of course, the perception in the West of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that the Israelis have the most power, and therefore they're the ones who can fix the problem. Now, this line of inquiry is not totally fruitless. Israelis in Tel Aviv in a cafe have more ability to engage in peace dialogue, probably, than a Palestinian in a tent in Gaza. Being in a war zone is horrible. It messes with your head. It causes all kinds of trauma. And on average, people in Tel Aviv have just much less violence. They're suffering much less physical violence and much less, just the trauma of war. Because yes, they are in a war zone to some extent, but it's quite different, because maybe they're getting some rockets from Yemen and from Gaza, but it's quite different than if you're in a tent in Gaza. Being in a war zone is horrible. It messes with your head. It causes all kinds of trauma. And on average, people in Tel Aviv have just much less violence. They're suffering much less physical violence and much less, just the trauma of war. Because yes, they are in a war zone to some extent, but it's quite different, because maybe they're getting some rockets from Yemen and from Gaza, but it's quite different than if you're in a tent in Gaza. There's some truth to the idea that Israelis have more ability to seek peace, but you can't just frame the entire conflict in terms of who has the most power. That's fundamentally dishonest, because conflicts are multifaceted and they're multifarious, and the causes of a conflict can be beyond the question of who has the most power. Just as the causes of the suffering of workers under capitalism is not necessarily the capitalist is being an evil oppressor and stealing their surplus value.
Chomsky was really horrified. He was taking Foucault as the most immoral man he ever met. So, one point after
it's not necessarily that may have been quite a good
just a
by Chomsky.
little side remark. One point I found remarkable is what could be called, like in quotation marks, the modernity of the Islamic State. There was no problem with indulging in one's bloodlust and beheading people. Even worse, it was all staged. It was all staged with cameras and social media. One could call this the assassination of barbarism. And it was horrifically repeated on the 7th of October, when people were killed in the most bestial way, and the perpetrators triumphantly uploaded the images to their victims' social media channels. To boast of barbarism in front of the world dwarfs even the crimes of the Nazi torturers. On the other hand, And here lies the terrible modernity. All these triumphalist crimes are something like advertising material that gains followers in the clickbait economy, your the sphere, an economy that even Western intellectuals are following. When Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, the composer, glorified 9/11 as the greatest work of art that the world had seen, when Jean Baudrillard and Michel Foucault romanticized Islamic terror, it's clear that even the intellectual elite isn't immune to such a relapse, leading to the question, could it be that Islamism is thriving precisely because our postmodern contemporaries also have a significant problem with the coldness of hyperreality in the digital age?
Well, I suppose one of the kind of central features of postmodernity and hyperrealism is value, not even value inversion, just value collapse, right?
Yeah.
It's kind
Yeah,
of this Nietzschean nihilism almost,
yeah,
right? Once Nietzsche talked about it in terms of European Christianity, God is dead, but that once you got rid of the kind of central pillar of Western morality, which in his thinking was the Christian structure. Once you got rid of that, you were left with nihilism, and I think to some extent that has been the truth. This is why I want one of many reasons why I've always had this skepticism of postmodernity. I think it's very, very good to question values and to disassemble values that are not working, but the question should always be about function. It shouldn't just be deconstruction for the sake of deconstruction, because the danger of that is if you are left with nihilism, what comes in to fill the void, right? People who are in this nihilistic structure, if they're looking for a way to structure their lives, if they're looking for something to believe in, and the traditional structures of Western society gone, for better or for worse, right? There's lots of negative things that you can say about Catholicism or Protestantism or all of the various schools of thought within those spheres. But if you're living in a highly nihilistic culture, the people who are not nihilistic, who might be coming from outside of that culture, are going to step in and they're going to see that as an opportunity. And I think radical Islamists see the nihilism that's on display in the West in some extent as an opportunity, as a recruitment opportunity.
yeah.
I think they genuinely and honestly believe it.
Yeah.
Sort of as a vindication of their worldview. If you believe in sexual liberation, if you believe in sex before marriage, for example, and people are going out and having sex before marriage, I think Islamists see that and they think, wow, these people don't have any values. We need to bring Islam to them because of course the consequences of the sexual liberation, sex before marriage, there are consequences to that. Personally, I believe in personal freedom. I believe in this kind of positive, forceful liberalism. I think liberals should be strong and assertive in asserting liberal values, and that's what we should believe in, is in liberalism and enlightenment and in the future and in technology and in the paradigm of human advancement. I believe we should colonize the stars. I'm a huge advocate for space exploration, for example. Right? Those are the positive things that I believe in.
We had Robert Zubrin, the Mars guy, on the show.
I'm in exalted company.
Yeah. But one thing which is really funny, just a little side remark, because like when Nietzsche thought about this, anything goes, which is the beginning of nihilism. That's Assassin's Creed. It's coming from the Assassin's Order, like this dogma, this battleground. Anything goes.
I will say that you can kind of turn that criticism around on groups like ISIS and Hamas, because they have a certain nihilism to them as well, because they're so fervent in their belief in the caliphate and in their belief in Islam and in their belief that Islam is a superior kind of moral system and economic system and governmental system to Western liberalism and to capitalism and also to Marxism, actually, ironically, for the Marxists who are open to Islamist ideology. Because they believe so fervently in this, they will pursue things like slaughtering innocents. That's what we saw on October the 7th. That's what we saw against the Yazidi. That's what we've seen in the ISIS caliphate, the small caliphate in Iraq and Syria.
John, as a peace activist, can peace be established in a politically religiously and spiritually complicated situation?
If a war is taking place, the war needs to end, and there needs to be someone to establish the peace. I think that's probably what needs to take place. I hope that the United States is still in a position to say, across the wider Middle East and not just in Israel and Palestine, that we are going to have peace in the Middle East. I hope the United States can help facilitate that. I hope the EU can help facilitate that. I hope the UK can help facilitate that. I hope that regional powers like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, who are a little bit more amenable to reconciliation with Israel, are looking to facilitate that. And I hope that the people and the groups who are kind of fervently determined to attack Israel and undermine Israel and to keep fighting in this eternal struggle for Islamic supremacy. The Qataris and the Iranians and the Houthis. I hope that those groups are marginalized and, ultimately fall from power.
You link postmodernism and nihilism, which is very, very, I do understand it very well. You cleverly addressed the question of late capitalism in a recent essay, and it's a value crisis of capitalism, which is playing out all over. And there's this famous quote that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, which, by the way, explains the enthusiasm for apocalyptic thinking, but more importantly, makes it clear the crisis of capitalism has other causes. Now I come to your music point. As a musician familiar with the world of digital recording, you understand when I tell you how I was fascinated in the early 90s experiencing the recording studio machinery disappearing into the computer, a void, so to speak. Isn't this a reflection of the root cause, the void of our current plight and the resentment we see in the Arab world, a discontent with digital modernity, with the void everybody's confronted with?
I think we're going through a global revolution. It's a global technological revolution, and it's predominantly being driven by automation. And
Sure.
I suppose the phenomenon you're talking about in the recording studio of the tape recorder becoming Pro Tools.
Yeah,
That's a good kind of a good metaphor for it. But it's going to go further than that, because ultimately you're going to be able to walk into a recording studio and the computer's going to do the recording for you. You can just do your little thing and the computer will fix everything. There's no need for a producer anymore, because it will all be automated by AI. That's what the Singularity is going to probably do for recording. Of course, there will be downsides to that. And there will be, a seasoned professional music producer will still have some value, but at the same time, it will be possible to completely automate. Just personally, now I'm a musician and I've spent a lot of time studying how to do it. But just with my laptop, I could make a whole album right now with my laptop and my guitar. I can use drum samples, I can use bass samples, I can use keyboard samples. So already there's a level of automation, but the level of automation is accelerating, and that's what we're seeing with the development of ChatGPT. That's what we're seeing with the development of robotics, and we're starting to see robotics as a platform, and you get the robot, and then you have inner robot software that can do certain functionalities. And this is going to completely change the way the global economy works. Essentially, capitalism is not going anywhere, but what is going to replace the current phase of capitalism is what I call auto-capitalism, where capitalism is automated and you have artificial intelligence agents who understand what they need to do, who can function dynamically over time and can react to events like a human being. You give an AI agent a job and it goes and does that. And you can put them into a robotic shell and they will go out into the world and they will do the things. So essentially, we're seeing the automation of the entire world on the basis of the fact that we have built machines that can operate in a thoughtful way. And this is going to have incredible economic consequences, because imagine a world where there are 10 billion people and 100 billion robots, and all of the robots have AI software that let them do 1.5 times or 2 times or even 10 times the amount of work that a human can do. It's a complete revolution. It's completely revolutionary. And one of the most important factors here, why it is the singularity, is because the robots and the AI will be self-improving and self-repairing. So you get this accelerative tendency. If they need more energy sources, they can go and build some solar panels in space, or they can go and build a nuclear fusion power plant, for example. I'm being highly speculative here, but the general trend is towards this incredible technological self-acceleration, and we are going to see that on an amazing scale in the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years. It's going to be a sight to behold, and it's going to create immense challenges, particularly in what are humans going to do now, and who gets to reap the rewards of owning this capital, because that's what robots ultimately are. They're the means of production, and you can own one yourself, right? Just as a simple example that people can get their heads around is like a cryptocurrency miner, right? You can own a Bitcoin miner, and it sits there and it produces Bitcoin for you, and people understand that because that's something people have done. So this is an insane technological revolution. I was following Andrew Yang, who's an American presidential candidate, in 20, I think it was 2016, and I agreed with all of his arguments then that ultimately we need some form of universal basic income to give everyone a level playing field, so that the wonderful thing about AI is it may have this playing field leveling effect, where what the most important currency will be ideas, because you need to have an idea and a good idea to succeed at things. Because I think in my lifetime, and maybe in your lifetime, and maybe for most of the history of humanity, execution was king. If you had a bad idea and you executed it well, you could still make money. But I think today it's becoming more important to have a good idea, and then AI will do the execution. I think that in the future of robots, I think that's what's really going to matter, is that, the person-to-person effect, having some level of potentially having what you call charisma, having the ability to connect with people socially, and imagination. I tend to agree with Andrew Yang that there needs to be some sort of universal basic income, but how that's going to emerge, I don't know. It's a long term issue that probably won't be solved in 2024, 2025, 2030. Probably we will still be fighting about this in 2050. What do we do about the fact that robots are doing the majority of the stuff now? And there will be the first trillionaire. There will be someone, maybe we'll get to someone with 5 trillion, 10 trillion. The inequality may well accelerate as the gains of robotics and AI are accumulated and agglomerated by the people who have the first mover position right now, the people who mined the early Bitcoins, the people who invested in Tesla and in Apple in 2010, 2015. So these problems aren't going to be solved immediately or imminently, but I think ultimately we have to respect human beings, and we have to we have to build a system that respects the autonomy of all of the people and gives people a chance to better their lives, right? I think robots can do a wonderful thing in automating drudgery that people don't want to do. Nobody grows up with a dream of being a guy working in the sewers, or a guy working on the on the highways shoveling gravel, or the guy in the furnace in the factory who, one wrong move, he falls over and he dies.
So, yes, taking this tab you just opened up onto the next question beautifully, John. If you're a science fiction writer and you're writing a book about the Middle East entering a period of stability, prosperity, and peace, what would that look like? And what steps must Islam evolve through to move to this state?
I think dialogue is incredibly important. I think listening to people, listening to their fears and hopes, trying to understand their humanity. I think that's kind of one of the most important factors that we could possibly conceptualize this through, because if you believe that the people on the other side are just these hateful, horrible, almost automata who are just out to kill you and out to steal your land, then that can be used to justify extreme violence. It can be used to justify hatred, and it's kind of a mechanism of dehumanization. So I think that the most important thing is people talking to each other and listening to each other and trying to understand each other and trying to understand each other's points of view. And maybe part of that process is people looking at their own point of view and saying, is my point of view really the right one? Right? Being self-critical, being able to criticize the people on your own side who may have acted as an obstacle to peace, or maybe have acted as an incitement to violence. So I think if I was a science fiction writer, I like writing science fiction. It's one of my hobbies. if I was a science fiction writer, I would, and I was writing about the Middle East becoming peaceful. It has to be human centered, right? I mean, we can talk about all of the robots constructing, mass solar farms in the Negev desert, or we can talk about, but potentially the conflict, the drone-on-drone conflict. We're already seeing drone-on-drone conflict. It's become particularly prevalent in Ukraine and Russia.
Sure.
But if
Revolutionary warfare.
we could like if I was writing about that, if I was writing about peace, the most important factor is the human factor. That's what we're doing here. We're these silly evolutionary apes who have evolved this incredible technological affinity, and it's easy to think of us in terms of all the technology that we create and the impact that has on the world, but in terms of progress and in terms of building a better future, it's got to be in terms of, we've got to think of it in terms of the human beings on both sides. So I'd like to see more people talking to each other, reaching out to each other, and trying to get their get their head around what do people on the other side really want.